Let's see if I can read my own notes here. I want to make a couple introductory points here, and I think that, I want to make a couple introductory points here. I'm so used to just yelling. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about some more technical details. The first point I want to make is that in many countries, politicians carry out many of their own surveys. And for those of us who engage in publicly available data, we have to really understand that people have strong prior beliefs, particularly if they are sponsoring their own polling. Because when organizations or politicians sponsor their own polling, they have strong reasons to believe that data over any data that is going to be publicly available. So when we're talking about trying to change people's views, we have to understand their prior beliefs. And I'm very interested in prior beliefs in a very wide variety of ways. The second point, which has been raised, but I think is worth raising again, is how we represent uncertainty more than in words. That is visual representation of uncertainty. There's been a lot of talk about uncertainty throughout the day here, but when we can explain the more we can explain to people that public opinion research is a process which is fraught with uncertainty, and it's very worth doing, but there is uncertainty associated with it, the better off we are, because we're less likely to overestimate what we say. We're more likely to not be wrong, which is much more important than in some ways being right. So I want to reiterate that point. The third point I want to make, and I'll provide some evidence for this, is that, and I think the last panel showed this point, is that if we want to engage politicians seriously, we have to take them at their prior beliefs as well. That is, we have to understand well what their issues are with data and what their issues are with public opinion polling before we can address the best strategy to do public opinion polling that helps them. What's quite interesting in the Georgian context specifically is that most of the issues that Georgian politicians have with public opinion data are exactly the issues that many academics, particularly political methodologists and quantitative social scientists, have been spending a lot of time trying to solve. So we have, in some ways, a fortunate ability to actually give some answers to these questions if people are willing to invest a little bit of time and resources in thinking about them. So what do politicians believe? I'll tell you what they believe, then I can give you some evidence, and then you can disagree with me later and tell me I'm wrong, because that's what this is about, a discussion. Generally, politicians in Georgia believe that social desirability bias is large, okay? And what do I mean by that? It means simply that the respondents are telling you what you want to hear, not what they actually believe. Second, differential response is large. We saw this in Anna Maria's earlier presentation in the US, where youth are supposedly, are responding to exit polls more often in the US. Politicians themselves believe that the people who are answering surveys in Georgia different groups are answering in different rates. And the third thing is that many foreigners come in and they poorly word questions because they don't have a full understanding of the intricacies of the Georgian language, which admittedly is one that has many intricacies. So I'm going to give you a little bit of evidence. It's certainly not conclusive. I randomly sampled over 250 Georgian politicians, those who ran and won and lost for office over 4 election cycles. I interviewed MPs, people who had previously been MPs, and people who had never been MPs. And many of them said similar things across the political spectrum, while many of them said very different things. I'm going to focus on some of the things that, and give you some representative quotes to give you a sense of some of this, which many of you have heard in the previous section. Okay, so taking social desirability bias, can people read that? It is an important thing that Georgian electorate is cheating. Sociologically, they are lying. They are not telling the truth, and I can tell precisely that they are lying. This was somebody, a UNM MP, who told me this. Okay. Our society traditionally will never give the right answer during the poll. A foreigner cannot understand this. In cultures such as Georgian or Russian, double coding is present, we think one way and act differently. This is somebody from the Republican Party. So I did this a little while ago. I know the political landscape has changed, but I think the sentiments remain the same. I cannot recall, what the thing is. Public opinion poll can never depict real picture. They all never say their real position, and you cannot trust them. Those are the people who have gone through the Turkish genocide, the Soviet period in a region that I'm going to not tell you about, informing against each other, imprisonment, executions, troubled years. They cannot trust anyone, especially when a stranger is asking things. Okay, I'm not going to read all these quotes, but they also, taking differential response seriously is another large issue. You can read some of the quotes yourself. And also people don't say things that they thought were a problem before they were afraid. So a lot of people playing on this issue of fear among the electorate. This was somebody from the former Christian Democratic Party. And there's a lot of questions about wording, and and I want to say that all these issues are very serious issues, and what we need to know is empirically the extent that these are issues and objectively address these questions rather than just saying they're issues but not trying to measure them in some way. And the third one is question wording, and I think this first example is quite interesting. I will give you an example. Do you want Georgia to improve its relationship with Russia? And 100% will say yes. If you say, do you want Georgia to have a closer relationship with Russia? And 100% will say no. So there is no objective question. One has to think carefully, okay? So the argument that very slight variation in the wording of questions will change people's views or answers to a question. I think these are all things that can be answered. And I think it's worth thinking among the research community about explicitly addressing them to politicians before they ask, because they probably won't ask. That is, most people who you present data to, they'll either think that you're trustworthy, or they will think that you are not trustworthy. They'll listen to you, and if they think you are not trustworthy, they will simply walk away and not listen to a word that you have said. So how do you gain trust with politicians? What do we know about cognitive learning? What have we learned in the last 30 years in behavioral economics? Well, we've learned that you have to actually foresee about what's going to make people believe that you're trustworthy and knowledgeable. And so one of the things you can do is actually specifically address these three issues to politicians. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I think there's an increasing battery of techniques to do so. So for social desirability bias, I'll just mention the name of two techniques: randomized response and list experiments. For differential response, there's a technique called multiple imputation, which I'll explain briefly, and collecting better non-response data so that you actually understand who is responding and who is not responding to your surveys. And from the question of question wording, I think, randomized permutation of question wording to show people that if you change the wording of those two Russia questions, people give you the same response or they don't. It's an empirical question that can be answered, but if you spend some time up front, then you can really help people believe that you've taken their concerns seriously. And all of this being said, you're making all of your methods more transparent while you're doing this, because you're explicitly, as many of the people here have said, you can make your microdata, as the Arab Barometer does, make your microdata publicly available, make your methods publicly available, and show what you've done. So I don't want to take up too much more time, but this is a visual representation of what multiple imputation looks like. One of the major problems with most surveys in the developing world and many surveys in the developed world is this red data is missing data, and everybody refuses to answer certain questions, and often theoretical margins of error or confidence intervals are reported without estimating the amount of data that is missing. Therefore, the uncertainty is much larger than the uncertainty that has been presented in the slides. The massive increase in computational power that's been made available within the last 10 years has made lots of techniques available to actually correct this problem. It does require much more statistical knowledge than the average bare has, the average person has, but it is eminently doable. The important thing here to notice is that people actually often don't respond to questions that are correlated with one another. So if you don't respond to one question, you often don't respond to another question that is very similarly related, making this process actually more difficult. So the first suggestion here is, spend time, particularly if you have the time, to develop multiple imputation models that actually deal with your missing data in meaningful ways, and actually potentially present more than one estimate of your data depending on how you've imputed your data, to show that any data is a model because you've sampled people, so that's a model to begin with. So again, there is not, there is uncertainty related with any of these models, and if you show potentially more than one model, you've shown that you are working in a world where models exist. This is, just to reiterate the point, this is from a recent paper that came out in the best political methodology journal that shows people who did not impute their data in academic journals and the correlation with their results being overturned when multiple imputation was done. And as you can see, all you need to know is on the y-axis is the percent of your data that is missing, and on the x-axis is the percent of the likelihood that your finding is going to be overturned. So the papers with more missing data had their findings overturned in a much higher rate. Okay, so this is not just a problem in the public opinion world. This is a problem in the academic world as well, and so this is a serious issue when academic findings are being overturned left and right on the basis of this same issue that is a major policy issue here in Georgia. This is quite small, so I'm not sure that you're going to be able to read it. And this is on the topic that we've all agreed is potentially not the topic that we want to spend the most time on, which is horse races. But this is something that was actually carried out in Russia and is what's known as a list experiment, which actually hides people's response to a question by burying it in a list of other options. So people don't actually have to express their true view. They just, all the researcher does is ask for the number of items that the respondent agrees actually has done in this case, so the behavior of the respondent. So if they voted for Putin, that's one thing they add up, but they actually don't have to tell you if they voted for Putin or not. So you can sum up the number of things on the list that you've done. You have to be careful that it's not 1 or 4, because then you get something called ceiling and floor effects, but that's beyond this conversation. But so what do you get out of that? And again, this is small and I apologize for it, but you can estimate the percentage of population that is lying to you about voting for Putin. And you can estimate the percentage of the population that is lying to you about voting for Putin by subgroup. So who lies about voting for Putin? Well, as it turns out, it's rich people. And why do rich people lie? Because they have the most to lose at higher rates. So there's differential rates of lying across subgroups in the population. So this very question of social desirability bias about saying that you have to vote for Putin because that's what the regime expects for you, there are sociological techniques developed specifically to hide the respondent from doing this. There are other, I'm just presenting one here today. The point is that we should be thinking specifically about how to do this, not only because we want accurate estimates, but because those kind of estimates are being demanded by the exact people who we're trying to convince. And so it's going to help the case of trying to convince these people if we can show them this data. I've run this in other contexts where it doesn't matter at all, and you can run the list experiment and show there's no difference. And that's also a very useful thing to do for a wholly different set of reasons. I think I've probably taken more time than I should, so I'll stop there.